Hey divers, Alec, Peirce again, Vintage Scuba. Got an interesting small chat for you today, a little video about pressure checkers. Now, pressure checkers today are not as common as they once were. Let me explain first of all what pressure checkers are. Kevin and I had a bit of a debate about what to call them. We used to call these pressure gauges. Pressure gauges. And it was a gauge that you used to check the pressure in your tank. And there was no confusion when I started diving because you had a pressure gauge or you didn't. You see? Now there's confusion because there's a pressure gauge that you use on the surface to check the pressure in your tank. You've seen them in air fill stations and maybe you have one. And there's a submersible pressure gauge as well. Plus there's mini pressure gauges and pony pressure gauges and on it goes. But if we have the two different types of gauges, the one that actually takes underwater, that actually attaches to your regulator, you all use them. They're mandatory gear, very important mandatory gear too. It's not one of those things you don't want, you do want it. A pressure gauge, and anytime through the dive you can take a look, oh yeah, I got lots of air left. You see, that's a pressure gauge, submersible pressure gauge. In fact, it's sometimes called an SPG. Well, what do we call the ones that we used to use on the surface? Because they're still around, it still is handy to be able to tell the pressure in your tank on the surface. Well, we can't really call it a pressure gauge. Can we call it a surface pressure gauge? That's still SPG, isn't it? So I call them a pressure checker. Tank pressure checker. You make up your own name. Anyway, if for some reason you want to have one, maybe you've got several tanks at home. Maybe you have a small supply of tanks, 4, 5, 6 tanks. And to take the regulator from tank to tank to tank to check each one and see how much air is in it is a bit of a nuisance. And you can go to your dive store even today and you can buy a pressure checker. Surface pressure gauge, whatever you want to call it. And it would look like this. Now, not just like this. This is old. This is from the 70s. It's a new in-the-box pressure checker. And you open the box up and you might be surprised to find it's almost exactly the same as this one. This one's brand new. The one that you would buy today in your local dive store would look just like this. It would have a gauge on it. Obviously, a gauge usually goes from 0 to 5,000 because the tanks today are 3,000. This one, I think, goes to 3,000, okay? So obviously this is old. The tanks at the time this came out were 2250 or maybe 2475. It only goes to 3,000. The one you get today will go to 5,000 because the tanks today are 3,000, maybe a bit more. But anyway, this is what it would look like. A gauge, probably rubber covered. It's a good idea to have a bit of cushioning on the gauge. They have a yoke, so it goes onto your tank, you see. Put it on the tank, and then you open the tank, and there's the pressure. Then you turn the tank off. Now, it also has to have one more thing. It has to have a bleed screw of some sort. Just as with your regulator, when you finish the dive, you turn the air off on the tank, but you need to take the air out of the hoses of the regulator. You need to purge the regulator, which you do usually by pressing the push button on the second stage. Then you can take it off. But on a pressure checker like this, you have to have a bleed screw. And here it is over here. So you open this and go, air comes out and you can take it off. So this is very, very much as you would purchase today in your local dive store, just like that. You know, they're not a whole lot of money, probably less than $100. They weren't all like that. The very first ones put out by U.S. divers and other big companies in the 50s were a lot cruder, not as sophisticated as today. Here's an example. This is brass. You couldn't use brass today because the pressures are too high. But back in those days, the pressure, the tanks were only 1,500, 1,800 psi. So although this gauge goes to 3,000, it never really went more than halfway up. This particular gauge is from the 60s. But it's very much the same. Gauge, yoke screw, and a little bleed screw on the side. Let the air out. Same type of thing with brass. Kind of interesting. Now here's another one. Similar, very similar, made by U.S. divers as well. Aqualung. This particular one says Aqualung Canada on it. Yeah, there was an Aqualung Canada. When Aqualung, the very large company that still exists today, it's not the same company as it once was, big company that once was, but the name still exists anyway. When they first came to North America, interestingly enough, they came to Canada first. A chap by the name of René Bouzeau came to Montreal, Canada, and he imported gear from France. U.S. divers gear from France and into Montreal, and he was going to sell it all across North America. Well, he soon discovered that there wasn't much of a market for scuba gear in Canada, so he very soon moved down to Los Angeles, and he started the U.S. Divers Company to sell scuba equipment, which has become U.S. Divers, USD, and from that they got the name Aqualung, And so this gauge is an Aqualung gauge. This gauge is Aqualung Canada because they had a division in Canada. Aqualung Hamilton, actually, is what it says. So there's a couple of gauges, and they're old as well, brass. Now here's another version, almost exactly the same as the one I showed you in the very beginning. Nicely chromed now, nice clear gauge, almost brand new. Here's another one. This is from a very, very well-known company, Nemrod. Nemrod, you may not have heard the name, but Nemrod was a big company many years ago, made in Spain. Well, Nemrod was in Spain. This particular brand, Nemrod, this was marketed in the United States, in North America, by a company called Seamless. But there's Nemrod equipment. You see it's very, very similar, yoke, bleeder, and gauge. Let's look at some that are a little bit different because they weren't all exactly the same as this. Let's look at an early gauge. Here's an example of an early gauge that's a bit different. This is Voit. Voit, wonderful company, big company, but they did have a tendency to make things a little different. They were trying to attract divers to their brands, as every company does, and they thought, rightly so, that they made things a little bit different, sometimes better, and sometimes not as good, but different anyway, that divers say, hey, that's kind of neat, some would. So this is very much the same device, but you can see that the gauge is now mounted at right angles. So here's the knob, goes onto the tank, here's the knob, you screw it in like this, turn the tank air on, measure the pressure, and then you turn the tank air off, and over here on the side, there's a little, you see the little, it's like a little pinwheel, like a little propeller. That's the bleed screw. So you'd open the bleed screw, let the air out, you can take it off. So same device, same function, worked just as well, just looked different. Another one is like that. Here we go. Here's another one. And this was from Sportways. Oh, my good friend Sam LeCoq. Sportways, big American company based in LA. This one's getting a little bit crusty. I have to clean it up a little bit. Same type of idea. This used to be really nicely chromed gauge, yoke screw, and on the side he's got the bleed screw. A little bit different bleed screw, easy to grab and turn. Let me show you one that's again another one's a little bit different. Here's one here. Now this particular gauge is odd in only one way, and that's in how they bleed the air. So it's the same type of right angle mount. Put on the tank, and then this one actually has a knob that you can open and close the tank gauge. Turn it off if you want to bleed it. And how do you bleed it? Push the button on the front, like that. And here it comes out. So it's the same idea, just a little different way of getting there. There was one other type of pressure gauge, a pressure checker, that was fairly common. This was made by Healthways. Very common, very popular. First of all, it was cheaper. I mean, these weren't expensive. Start with 20 bucks. Probably get you a pretty good one. $30 to get you a really, really good one. Doesn't sound like much, does it? A lot of people in those days worked all day to earn $20. But anyway, this was an interesting gauge. And this gauge as well was marketed by that great company, Healthways. Great American company, around for many, many years. Their gear was fantastic. A good company. And similar as well to the other ones. Yoke screw, and a gauge. Uh-oh. What's missing? Kevin, what'd you do with the bleed screw? There is no bleed screw on this particular one. That's what made it unique. So this particular gauge from Healthways was kind of interesting. You would put it on the tank, okay, put it in place, turn the air on, check the pressure, good, 2,500 psi, good, turn it off, right? You would take the gauge and bend it. And the mechanism was set up in such a way that it would bleed the air from the gauge. Just that simple. And take the gauge off. Made it simpler, a little less expensive, and it worked pretty well. They did tend to break a little bit, maybe partly because they were cheaper, and so people would tend to go back to the more tried and true, stronger models, like the first one I showed you. This is a type of pressure checker, and these are still sold. We still sell them at our dive stores that we work at here in Ontario, and they're very common, and they work exactly the same. So if you do need a pressure gauge of some sort to measure the pressure in your tank, and you're looking for something a little handier than the submersible, then go back to these good old-fashioned gauges that we've had around for a long time. I've often told the story because people would ask me, how did you know how much air you had in your tank before there were pressure gauges, submersible pressure gauges? First submersible pressure gauge came out in 1962 from Sam LeCoq, again from Sportways. But they were expensive. Oh gosh, they were $30 or $40. Nobody would buy one. So we kept diving for a long time after that. Well, as you probably know the answer to that question. First of all, we knew how much air was in the tank because we would check it with a pressure checker before we went in. And then, as I say, sometimes rather jokingly, we would check it when we came out to see if we had enough air to make that dive. Well, obviously that's a joke. We would check it when we came out, but while we were diving, we had a reserve, a J valve on our tank. So when we ran out of air, it would restrict the air, and we could pull the reserve and give us another 4 or 5 minutes to get safely back to the surface. Boy, I'm glad that submersible pressure gauges came along. Thank you, Sam Laco, for making that first pressure gauge. The Seaview. Maybe we'll talk about submersible pressure gauges sometime soon. Okay, guys, I hope there was something there of interest to you. Keep the comments coming. Questions, ideas. Love to hear from you. Alec, Peirce, Vintage Scuba.